suppose there was a really key moment in my work as a dancer, and I was living in London, and I'd just started to create work and establish a kind of company, I suppose, but starting that development as a choreographer. And there were one or two places where you could perform, but there was, for me, I did that for 2 or 3 years, and then there was a moment where I felt that who were my audiences, and although that's not intrinsic to the creative process in my feeling, but who was I performing to? Who was involved in seeing the work, taking part, participating, and there was this sense that you were creating work for the dance community, which in London was still, small and at a certain level. And so there was a kind of feeling like I was just kind of working in a very, very narrow spectrum, actually, and where were my influences? And it felt like all my ideas, all my kind of thoughts on what I was ideas for creating work was based on actually kind of living within this little bubble, and then we would perform in those dance venues, and then other dancers would come and see the work. So there was a moment where I actually just kind of stopped and just had to really reappraise what I was doing, why I was doing it, why I was creating work, who for, what was the relevance in a wider situation. Was I responding to the life around me, to the situation that I was living in? And I always felt, and I think it's a struggle that other dancers feel sometimes, that there's a disconnect with your practice and the life you're living, and the life you're in and the society you're in. So, and that's part of our process of being wrapped up in a dance studio for hours and hours and hours, and your practice training, for hours in a dance studio. So it just felt quite narrow, and in a sense I always felt that I was drawn to kind of trying to push into different areas to engage with ideas outside of my own direct experience, to engage with people and other experiences, and that could feed back into my work, and that would be on in terms of of themes that I would explore, but also in terms of where I would perform, and who I would make work with and who I would make work for. So there was lots of different things, and that's, I think, a moment where I kind of just stopped and had to take stock,
I think with the development of relational aesthetics and a kind of a language that seemed to follow, Bourriard's work in this area in the 1990s, I guess what evolved was a critical language, an art language around these kinds of an idea of an engagement. I don't think that engagement was necessarily related to particular forms of class or anything like it. I think it was related to an idea of artwork outlooking, but it also meant that I think that this wasn't necessarily a new thing. Looking at social models, or Boyce's famous phrase of saying that I am a field artist, I am in the field. So I think what it managed to do, though, was to create a kind of a coherence around work that had been socially engaged, but create a critical language around forms of social engagement as a critical space for practice, and that have a new dynamic or a particular dynamic that was able to more properly articulate itself and to contest, or at least create an alternative to the single practitioner model, really. So I think in a way some of those activities that might have been seen as community arts before, or under other headings, gradually started to become more central within an art discourse, as opposed to being marginal or more marginal within an arts discourse.
mean, I know the report you're referring to is their strategic review that the Arts Council did that they published last summer, and it's a whole series of recommendations. And yes, there's a key kind of question about, you know, the extent to which the Arts Council considers the public in its funding decisions. I don't think it'll be as crude. I would like to think it won't be as crude as everybody in receipt of funding is asked to spend X amount or X percentage on socially engaged practice. The Arts Council did do that about 20 years ago. They passed something at council which suggested that people might spend 5%, theatre companies in particular, or maybe I was just working in that area at the time, that theatre companies would spend 5% of their budget on children and young people, which caused a little bit of freeze-on within the kind of wider theatre community. Some people tried to engage with that, but I think it was also felt, you know, working with children or working with socially engaged practice is a skill in itself, and it's not everybody's forte, it's not everybody's interest, and not everybody, even if they might want to do it, not everybody just has the kind of temperament or capacity to kind of work that way. And I think it would be far worse to insist that people worked that way and worked badly as a result. It has to be natural for them. I think if it's forced, it doesn't work. And we've seen that, you know, over the years with issue-based theatre or educationally based theatre, where it's trying to teach something or, you know, convey something. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it just feels a little bit kind of forced. So I think the artist's own interest and methodologies are key.
But a teaching style isn't going to work. And again, we're back to what resources do dancers have to do this work. So a dancer might, as you said, build up to teaching class. But teaching class is not going to work in a community. The idea of I give information, you take on information, interpret and repeat. That's not going to work with someone who has nothing for that to kind of know. Yeah, there's no fertile soil for those seeds to land in. So we're back to then facilitation processes. How do I offer something that allows you to come in to where I am? I mean, that is a skill in its own right. And there are amazing people writing on that subject and teaching in that subject, but maybe it's about that as well, about having some great teachers come over. You know, you have Chrissy Poulter in Trinity, who, you know, that was her whole area of expertise. And again, all Trinity acting students would have done facilitation processes as part of their training. So is there just something to be done there to bridge, I guess, like a continuing professional development to bridge the gap after the fact? Okay, you've now been out in the world, you've been working for 5 years, you're thinking about choreography and might like to work with the community. Here are some, like a 10-week course of like skills, processes to learn.
Oh, I think all of these terms are contested. I think the term community is contested. I don't think there's an agreement about what that is precisely. I think there's no agreements about what participation is precisely. I think all of these things are a kind of in fluid or in some sort of at least transitional flux. And I don't think either that this was particularly about replacing one thing with another thing. I think it was about a series, you know, the growth of a series of alternative ways of working about which practitioners could make choices, you know, about how subject, meaning, control, authorship, how all of those things might be brokered with others. And I guess it's for people to make decisions about where they place value, about how they develop credibility around the sites and situations, about where they develop things, how they develop things, and who they develop things with and who for. So all of those things, I think, are big questions, fundamental questions for practitioners about where to situate a practice. So in a sense, I think, a lot of us were, relatively formally trained, if you like, and I suppose that was about having an individual, about having control, and about, in a studio-based environment, about kind of enacting that control along the lines of one's own personal wishes. So I think the renegotiation of that kind of control is an interesting question for practitioners, and I think doesn't go away. I don't think the renegotiation of control is at all easy. But your question was about whether there was a way for these kinds of practice to travel, and I think of course that's still clearly in transition. But I also think there's a greater responsibility, either demanded or required, of practitioners who are in receipt of public money, and I think that has, there's a whole kind of series of criteria that has changed there.
Yeah, I think people engage in different ways. Some people less, some people more. And of course everybody has their own methods and methodologies and ways of engaging. But I think there's a real... I do feel that there's a kind of recognition that the only way we're going to develop as a professional community in Ireland, which is still very small, is to engage with the non-professional community. And we keep coming back to this word community, and I have to say, community is such a kind of a toxic sometimes word, because as soon as you say community, it means those people are not professional, but professional dancers are a community, so we're all communities. When you say community dance, you place it as other. You place it at, that's community dance, and that's it. I have never ever said I'm a community dancer, because there's a sense of it being lesser, and I don't see it as something lesser. I see it as something that's just different, And people who come with difficulties with right and left, hey, I experienced that as well. So, but they come with their own physical experiences, and those physical experiences give much to a choreographer. They don't necessarily have to be dance experiences to be valid as a source of creative development in dance. So.
I guess there's a feeling that the elements that are asked for, can appear tick box, if one doesn't intend to do them. I guess the challenge is how you make those processes intrinsic rather than extrinsic to your process. So, I'm guessing that. I have faith in artists and practitioners in making these kind of processes meaningful in whatever way one has to construct meaning and value around anything that one does. And I think that is a constant struggle for an artist or dancer, I guess, is, how might we make meaning, and who might we make meaning with, and what value does this have? So those questions of what constructs value, I think we know some of those from the histories of practice that we have. We know that some institutions and some kinds of framing create value, and that value has been created over some time, over a long time. But I think increasingly there are other ways of trying to create value, to create credibility, to build audience, and I don't think any of those are easy. I don't think, oh well, I'll just do it this way then and that'll work. I do think, like with any piece of work, it's a constant struggle to be on that kind of edge or dialogue, but I think that's what a creative process is and continues to be, which is why I think it gets harder and not easier. you know.
I'm not going to go and make a piece that's necessarily accessible, but I do want to make work, in a sense, from my own perspective, I want to make work where people understand it. And that's a continual struggle anyway with movement as a non-verbal language. It's a continual struggle of how you make exciting, interesting, engaging work mean something and people understand it. I mean, how many times have you sat in an audience and people turn to you and say, well, you're the dancer, what did that mean? And I say, well, what did it mean to you, So I think part of that process of working with people in communities is to engage them in a more poetic process where they say, to give them confidence to interpret for themselves, like reading a piece of poetry, to also say, you can understand this, it's not rocket science, and you can have the confidence as a member of the audience to like it and not like it, to understand it, to disagree with it, to enjoy it, to not enjoy it. So I think as part of an engagement with an audience is to give them the confidence in seeing and viewing dance.